The year is 987. The place, the ancient city of Senlis. Inside a vaulted stone hall, the air hangs heavy with incense and the sweat of nervous men. Listen, you can hear the rustle of heavy wool robes, the metallic clink of a sword belt shifting under a tunic, the low murmur of prayers mumbled into thick beards. On a makeshift throne of simple oak sits a man who does not look like a king. His name is Hugh, and they call him the Capet for the short cloak he prefers to the flowing robes of power. He is a duke, yes, but his lands are small, his treasury lean, and the lords who have gathered here today could crush him if they chose to. Yet, they are about to place a crown upon his head. Why? The old Carolingian line, the blood of Charlemagne, has finally run dry. The great families of France, the counts and dukes who rule vast territories as their own private kingdoms, face a choice. They could tear the realm apart fighting for the throne, or they could elect a king so weak he could never threaten them. They look at Hugh Capet, this quiet, practical man, and they see the perfect puppet. They see a king who will rule Paris and Orleans and little else. A king who will bless their power, but never challenge it. But what they do not see, as the crown of West Francia is placed upon his head, is the seed of a miracle. They do not see that this unassuming duke, this compromise candidate, will become the father of a line of kings who will rule not for decades, but for over 800 years. They do not see that from this day forward, the Capetian Dynasty will forge the very soul of France, transforming a patchwork of feudal fiefdoms into the most powerful, centralized monarchy in Europe. The question that echoes through that cold stone hall, a question that will take 8 centuries to answer, is this: how did the weakest king in Europe build the longest-ruling dynasty in history? To understand how a king with no power built an empire that would outlast empires, we must leave the incense and whispers of Senlis behind and walk into the cold, damp reality of a world where a king was just another lord. We must go back to the beginning, shall we? Chapter 1: The Reluctant King. In the cool, gray light of a summer morning in the year 987, the great men of West Francia, the counts, the dukes, the bishops who held the power of God and the sword, filed into the castle of Senlis. They came on horseback, their retinues clattering through the gates, their banners identifying them as masters of vast territory. The Duke of Aquitaine, whose lands stretched to the Pyrenees, the Count of Flanders, whose wealth came from the wool trade of the north, the Duke of Burgundy, a prince of the old Carolingian line himself. They gathered in the great hall, a space of cold stone and high, narrow windows that let in strips of light. There was no throne, not yet. There was only a table and on it a crown. For nearly 2 centuries, the crown of West Francia had rested on the heads of the Carolingians, the heirs of Charlemagne. But their line had faltered. The last legitimate heir, Louis V, a young man they called the Do-Nothing, had died in a hunting accident just a year before, falling from his horse and fracturing his skull. He left no children, and so the kingdom faced a vacuum. The question was not who had the best claim by blood, for there were distant Carolingian claimants across the border in Germany. The question was who the great lords would choose to be their king. Among them, watching from the edges of the crowd, stood a man who did not push his way to the front. He was tall for his time, with a direct, practical gaze. He wore no crown, no elaborate robes of state. He dressed in the short cloak of a soldier, the capa that would one day give him his nickname. This was Hugh, the Duke of the Franks, the Count of Paris and Orleans. He was, by any measure, one of the most powerful men in the room, but he was also deeply aware of his own precarious position. He controlled the lands around Paris and Orleans, a fertile region, but small compared to the sprawling domains of the Duke of Aquitaine or the Count of Toulouse. He could not command them. He could only hope to earn their vote. Historians often frame Hugh's election as a cynical bargain. The most powerful lords, so the theory goes, did not want a strong king. They wanted a figurehead, a man who would perform the sacred rituals of kingship, crowning bishops, protecting monasteries, leading prayers, but who would never have the military strength to impose his will on them. They wanted a king who was, in effect, first among equals, but an equal whose lands they did not covet and whose army they did not fear. Adalberon, the powerful archbishop of Rheims, a master of politics who wore his ecclesiastical robes like a suit of armor, argued for Hugh. His famous speech to the assembled nobles, recorded by the monk Richard of Rheims, laid out the pragmatic case. Raised to the throne the Duke Hugh, he is illustrious by his deeds, by his nobility, and by his armed forces. In him you will find a defender not only of the public welfare but also of your private interests. The phrase "your private interests" is the key. Adalberon was not appealing to their sense of national unity. Such a concept barely existed. He was appealing to their self-interest. Hugh, he promised, would be a king who served them. The assembly agreed. They elected Hugh, and on the 3rd of July, 987, in the Cathedral of Noyon, the Bishop of Reims placed the crown upon his head. Imagine the scene. The chill of the stone cathedral, the smell of incense thick enough to taste, the shimmer of gold thread in the vestments of the clergy. As the crown settled onto his brow, Hugh Capet became something he had not been an hour before. He became sacred. He became the Lord's anointed, a king chosen by God. But as he rose and turned to face the assembly of dukes and counts who had just elected him, what did he see in their eyes? Did he see loyalty? Or did he see the satisfied smiles of men who believed they had just hired a very useful and very weak employee? His first act as king reveals his understanding of the trap he was in. He did not issue a command. He could not. Instead, he made a request. He asked the assembled lords to confirm his possession of the abbeys and estates he already held as duke. It was a small, almost humble request, a tacit admission that his authority as king did not automatically extend to his own property. They agreed. It was a small victory, the first of many small victories he would need to fight for, not on battlefields, but in the silent war of courtly politics. The true test of his kingship came almost immediately. In the Carolingian tradition, kingship was elective, but it was also hereditary. The great families expected a king to name his successor, and for that successor to be confirmed during the old king's lifetime. This was the mechanism that prevented the throne from falling vacant. Hugh, looking at his eldest son, Robert, understood that if he did not secure Robert's future now, the fragile Capetian claim could evaporate the moment he died. The lords who had elected him might well elect someone else next time. And so, a year after his own coronation, in December of 987, Hugh summoned another assembly. The request he made was radical. He asked them to accept his son, Robert, as their future king and to crown him immediately as co-ruler. This was an aggressive power play, a direct challenge to the elective principle that had put him on the throne. He was essentially saying, "You elected me, and now I am asking you to make my office hereditary." The lords hesitated. This was not the deal they had made. They had elected a weak king, and now he was trying to build a dynasty. But Hugh, the supposedly weak king, had a lever they had not anticipated. He controlled the royal abbeys, the great monasteries that were centers of wealth, learning, and political influence. He could grant them to loyal bishops, or he could withhold their revenues from the nobles who relied on them. He had spent his first year building alliances, rewarding his supporters and quietly reminding his potential opponents of what they stood to lose. He also made a crucial concession, one that reveals his strategic genius. Robert, he agreed, would be anointed and crowned, but he would rule only under his father's guidance. The power would remain, for now, in Hugh's hand. It was a compromise, a way to give the lords the candidate they had not chosen, while reassuring them that the new king would not be free to act independently. The assembly grudgingly consented. On that same day in the Cathedral of Orleans, the crown was placed on the head of Robert, a young man just entering his 20s. He was known as Robert the Pious, a man who would one day be loved by his people for his piety and his charity. But on that day, he was simply the insurance policy. The Capetian Dynasty, in its most technical sense, was now born, a father and son, ruling together, ensuring that the line would not break. Consider the fragility of it all. Hugh Capet could not raise taxes at will. He could not march an army across France to subdue a rebellious vassal. His power was moral, ecclesiastical, and personal. He held the throne because the men who could take it from him did not want the trouble of ruling themselves. His reign was a constant, exhausting negotiation. He spent his years traveling between his few loyal cities, Paris, Orleans, Senlis, showing his face, dispensing justice under a tree, confirming the privileges of a monastery in exchange for its prayers and its political support. When Hugh Capet died in 996, after 9 years on the throne, he left his son a kingdom that was, on paper, no larger than the one he had inherited. But he left him something far more valuable. He left him a crown that had passed from father to son, a precedent of hereditary succession that was now, however fragile, established. He left him the sacred oil of Reims, the unbroken line of anointed kings. He left him a strategy unspoken but understood. Survive. Just survive. Outlast your rivals, marry wisely, have sons, and let time, the slowest and most patient of allies, do the rest. This was the reluctant inheritance of Robert the Pious. He did not inherit an empire. He inherited a strategy. He inherited a long game. And as he took up the crown his father had placed upon his head, he must have looked out at the vast, untamed lands of France, at the dukes who ruled like kings and the counts who bowed only when it suited them, and asked the same question his father had asked. The question that would haunt and guide his descendants for the next 800 years. How do you build an empire when you don't even truly own the ground beneath your throne? The France that Robert the Pious inherited in 996 was not a country in any modern sense. It was a mosaic, a patchwork of competing loyalty, distinct languages, and fiercely independent lordships, stitched together by the fading memory of Charlemagne's empire and the universal authority of the Church. To understand the Capetian genius, one must first understand the world they inhabited, a world where the king's voice carried only as far as his horsemen could ride in a week. In the south, the Count of Toulouse governed lands where the local tongue resembled Italian more than the speech of Paris. In the west, the Duke of Aquitaine presided over a court renowned throughout Christendom for its poetry and learning, a court that regarded the northern kings as barely civilized warlords. In the east, the Count of Champagne controlled the great trade fairs where merchants from Italy and Flanders exchanged silks, spices, and wool. And in the north, the Count of Flanders ruled a land of bustling cities and wealthy textile mills, his authority so absolute that he minted his own coins that bore his face, not the king's. These men did not consider themselves subjects. They considered themselves peers of the king, his equals in all but name. When they swore oaths of fealty to Robert, they did so with their hands on relics, promising loyalty, but their eyes held reservations. The oath was a contract, not a surrender. And like any contract, it could be broken if the king failed to uphold his end, if he proved weak, if he proved unjust, if he proved unworthy of their allegiance. Robert the Pious, however, possessed a weapon his father had lacked. He possessed the quality that would become the Capetian trademark: patience. He was, by all accounts, a gentle soul. The chroniclers of his age describe him as kind, scholarly, deeply religious. He rose before dawn to pray. He composed hymns that would be sung in churches for centuries. He washed the feet of the poor on Maundy Thursday, a ritual of humility that his subjects found profoundly moving. In an age of iron, Robert ruled with velvet gloves. But beneath that velvet, his grip on the crown never slackened. Consider his approach to the most dangerous threat he faced: the ambitions of his own cousin, Odo II, the Count of Blois. Odo was everything Robert was not: aggressive, expansionist, hungry for power. He controlled strategic territories to the west and south of Paris, and he made no secret of his desire to swallow the royal lands whole. He built castles on contested borders. He intimidated royal officials. He acted, in every practical sense, like a king. Robert could have raised an army. He could have marched on Blois, burned Odo's castles, and attempted to crush him by force. But such a campaign would have been costly, uncertain, and likely to provoke other lords to intervene on Odo's behalf, fearing that a king who crushed one count might one day crush them all. So Robert did something far more effective. He waited, he watched, and he built alliances where Odo least expected them. He cultivated the church. Robert understood something that would become a cornerstone of Capetian strategy. The bishops of France were not merely spiritual leaders. They were landowners, fortress holders, political powers in their own right, and they owed their appointments, at least in theory, to the king's approval. Robert ensured that loyal men occupied the great sees: Reims, Sens, Orleans, Paris. He granted them privileges, confirmed their lands, defended their rights. In return, they became his voice in the regions where he could not go. They preached loyalty to the Capetian line. They reminded the faithful that to oppose the Lord's anointed was to oppose God himself. This was not cynical manipulation. Robert genuinely believed in the sacred nature of his office. But his faith and his politics were inseparable. When he knelt in prayer, he was also building his kingdom. When he chanted the liturgy, he was also weaving the web of alliances that would protect his son's inheritance. The chronicler Helgaud of Fleury, who knew Robert personally, recorded a revealing incident. A poor peasant from the royal domain came to the king, complaining that a local lord had seized his land. By the custom of the age, this was a minor matter beneath the king's notice. But Robert did not dismiss the man. He summoned the lord, heard both sides, and rendered a judgment that restored the peasant's fee. The lord, humiliated, protested. Robert's response, as recorded by Helgaud, was simple. I am king not only over the powerful, but over the humble as well. God will ask me to account for the souls of all my people, not just the rich. Imagine the ripple effect of such an act. The peasant returned to his village, telling the story of the king who listened. The lord returned to his castle, nursing his grievance but also understanding that this king, this seemingly gentle man, possessed a moral authority that could not be challenged with swords alone. Word spread through the countryside. The Capetian king was a just king. He was a king who protected the weak. He was a king worthy of the name. Robert's greatest political crisis, however, came not from a rival count but from his own heart. He fell in love. The object of his affection was Bertha of Burgundy, a beautiful and accomplished woman who happened to be his cousin. In the eyes of the church, such a union was forbidden without a special dispensation. Worse, Bertha was the widow of Odo I of Blois, making her the mother of Odo II, Robert's most dangerous enemy. Marrying her would mean becoming stepfather to the man who sought to destroy him. But Robert was in love. He pursued Bertha with a passion that scandalized the court. He obtained a dispensation from a compliant bishop and married her in secret, hoping to present the church with a fait accompli. For a brief, intoxicating period, he was happy. He had a wife he adored, and through her, he hoped to forge a lasting peace with the house of Blois. The church, however, did not see it that way. Pope Gregory V, a German appointed by the Holy Roman Emperor, declared the marriage incestuous and invalid. He summoned Robert to appear before a synod and answer for his disobedience. When Robert refused, the Pope excommunicated him. Imagine the weight of that word. Excommunication meant exclusion from the sacraments. It meant that no priest could hear his confession, no bishop could bless his reign, no church could offer him sanctuary. It meant, in the eyes of the faithful, that his soul was in mortal danger. Robert faced an impossible choice. He could cling to Bertha and risk losing his kingdom, for a king cut off from God could not long command the loyalty of a Christian people, or he could renounce the woman he loved and submit to the church's authority. The chroniclers describe his anguish. They speak of sleepless nights, of tears shed in the privacy of his chapel, of a king torn between love and duty. In the end, duty won. Robert separated from Bertha, obtained an annulment, and performed public penance. He married Constance of Arles, a Provençal woman of fierce ambition and formidable will. It was a political marriage, arranged to strengthen ties with the South, and it brought Robert little happiness. Constance was domineering, constantly scheming to advance her own favorites at court, but she gave Robert something Bertha could not: sons. Sons who would carry the Capetian line forward. The lesson of Robert's marriage crisis was not lost on his descendant. The Capetians learned that the church was not merely an ally, it was the ultimate arbiter of legitimacy. A king who lost the church's blessing lost everything. And so, generation after generation, they cultivated Rome, protected monastery, funded cathedral, and presented themselves as the most Christian kings of Christendom. It was a strategy that would pay dividends for centuries. Robert the Pious died in 1031 after a reign of 35 years. He left behind a kingdom that was, by any objective measure, still weak. The great duchies remained independent. The royal treasury was modest. The royal army could not hope to conquer a determined enemy. But Robert left behind something intangible yet invaluable: a reputation. The people of France remembered him as the good king, the pious king, the king who washed the feet of the poor. And in that memory, the Capetian claim to the throne grew just a little stronger, a little deeper, a little more unshakable. His son Henry I inherited the crown, and Henry in turn faced the same challenges his father and grandfather had faced. The great lords tested him. His own mother, Constance, plotted against him, favoring her younger son Robert for the throne. For a time, it seemed the Capetian experiment might collapse in civil war, but Henry survived. He outlasted his rivals. He married a princess from Kiev, Anne of Ruse, bringing fresh blood and distant alliances to the Capetian line. And when he died in 1060, he left the throne to his son Philip I, a boy of 7. The Capetians had now held the crown for over 70 years. They had survived excommunication, civil war, and the constant pressure of more powerful vassals. They had not expanded their land significantly. They had not built an army worthy of the name, but they had done something more important. They had made the hereditary principle stick. The great lords of France no longer expected to elect their king. They expected a Capetian to inherit the crown. The dynasty had become, in the minds of the powerful, inevitable. But inevitability is not the same as power. And in the 11th century, a new threat emerged that would test the Capetian strategy of patience to its breaking point. Across the English Channel, a dynasty of conquerors was rising, men who did not wait for time to work its magic, men who took what they wanted with fire and sword. These men, the Normans, would soon cast their eyes upon the lands of the French king, and they would not ask permission. The question that hung over the reign of Philip I, a child king in a dangerous world, was simple. Could patience survive against ambition? Could the slow, careful work of the early Capetians withstand the onslaught of men who believed that kingdoms were won, not inherited? The answer would come from a castle in Normandy, where a bastard son was sharpening his sword, dreaming of a crown. Chapter 2: The Anointed Strategy. The 11th century bled into the 12th, and the Capetian kings continued their slow, deliberate march through time. Philip I, who had inherited the throne as a boy in 1060, would rule for 48 years, an eternity in an age when kings often died by the sword or the fever. He was not a great king by conventional measure. He was, by many accounts, lazy, gluttonous, and scandalous. He abandoned his wife for the wife of his own vassal, the Count of Anjou, earning excommunication and the contempt of the pious. But Philip understood something that his more virtuous contemporaries did not. Survival was victory, and he survived. To understand the Capetian strategy, one must understand the nature of power in feudal Europe. Power was not abstract. It was not measured in armies alone, or in treasuries, or in the size of a kingdom on a map. Power was personal. It was the oath sworn on relics, the kiss of peace exchanged between lord and vassal, the grant of land that bound a family to the crown for generations. And at the heart of this personal power lay something intangible yet undeniable: sacredness. The Capetians did not invent the sacred nature of kingship. That tradition stretched back to the Old Testament, to David and Solomon, to the bishops who anointed the Merovingian and Carolingian kings. But they perfected it. They turned it into a science. They understood that a king who was merely powerful could be challenged by another powerful man, but a king who was holy, a king who bore the mark of God upon his brow, such a king could not be challenged without risking damnation. The source of this sacred power was the holy oil of Rheims. According to legend, when Clovis, the first Christian king of the Franks, was baptized in the late 5th century, a dove descended from heaven carrying a vial of sacred oil. This oil, the Saint Ampoule, was preserved in the Cathedral of Rheims and used for the coronation of every subsequent king. No other monarchy in Europe possessed such a relic. The kings of England, Germany, Spain, they were crowned with ordinary oil blessed by bishops but human in origin. The Capetians were anointed with oil from heaven itself. They were, in a very real sense, touched by God. Imagine the psychological weight of that belief. When a Capetian king processed through the streets of Rheims on his coronation day, robed in silk and gold, the crown heavy on his head, the people who knelt before him did not see a mere man. They saw a living icon, a bridge between earth and heaven. They believed that his touch could cure the sick, that his prayers carried special weight, that his person was inviolable. To raise a hand against the king was to raise a hand against God. This belief was not merely propaganda. The Capetians themselves seem to have internalized. Louis VI, who ruled from 1108 to 1137, was a warrior king, a big man who spent his life in the saddle fighting petty lords who terrorized the royal domain. He was called the Fat in his later years, a nickname that speaks to the physical toll of his labor. But he was also deeply pious, a protector of churches, a friend to abbots. When he rode out to besiege a rebel castle, he carried with him the oriflamme, the sacred banner of the Abbey of Saint-Denis, said to have been given to Charlemagne by an angel. The banner was a promise. God fought with the king. The abbot Suger of Saint-Denis, Louis VI's closest advisor and the man who would become the first great chronicler of the Capetian Dynasty, understood this sacred politics better than anyone. Suger was a small man, of humble birth, but his intelligence and loyalty earned him the king's trust. He spent his life building the Abbey of Saint-Denis into the spiritual heart of the monarchy, filling it with gold, jewels, and relics, crafting a space so beautiful that it seemed to anticipate heaven itself. And in his writings, he articulated the Capetian vision. The King of France was not merely a ruler. He was the vicar of Christ in his realm, the defender of the Church, the arbiter of justice under God. Suger's most famous work, The Life of Louis VI, is not a neutral history. It is a manifesto, a carefully constructed argument for Capetian legitimacy. In its pages, Louis emerges as a hero, a king who fights not for personal glory but for the peace of the realm and the protection of the weak. When he defeats the robber barons who plague the countryside, Suger presents it as a sacred duty, a cleansing of the land. When he defends the rights of a monastery against a greedy lord, Suger frames it as an act of piety. Louis VI, in Suger's telling, is not merely a king. He is a saint in armor. But sacred power alone could not hold the throne. The Capetians needed something more practical, more earthly. They needed to ensure that the crown passed smoothly from father to son, generation after generation. And here, they developed a strategy so simple, so elegant, that it seems obvious in retrospect. They crowned their heirs during their own lifetime. This practice, known as associate kingship, had been used by Hugh Capet himself when he crowned Robert the Pious. But his successors refined it into an unbreakable tradition. When Louis VI felt his health failing in 1129, he summoned the great lords of the realm to Reims and had them witness the coronation of his son, also named Louis, who would become Louis VII. The boy was only 9 years old. He could not rule, he could not fight, but he could be anointed. And once anointed, his claim to the throne was sacred, undeniable, and independent of any earthly power. Consider the implications of this strategy. In other kingdoms, the death of a king was a moment of crisis. Ambitious men saw their opportunity. Rivals pressed their claim. Civil war often followed. But in France, when a Capetian king died, there was no interregnum. There was no vacancy. The crown already rested on the head of his son, who had been God's anointed for years. The transition was seamless, automatic, almost invisible. The great lords of France grumbled, of course. They understood what the Capetians were doing. By crowning their heirs young, the kings robbed the nobility of their ancient right to elect a successor. But the lords could not easily oppose a crowned king, a boy who had already received the holy oil of Reims. To challenge him was to challenge God, and so they bowed, they swore their oaths, and they waited for the boy to grow into a man they could perhaps manipulate. But the Capetians had another strategy, one that would prove even more effective in the long run. They outlived everyone. In an age of short lives and violent deaths, the Capetian kings enjoyed remarkable longevity. Hugh Capet lived into his 50s, old age for his time. Robert the Pious reigned for 35 years. Henry I for 29, Philip I for 48, Louis VI for 29. Generation after generation, the Capetians occupied the throne while the great families around them saw their lines fail, their fortunes fade, their ambitions crumble. This was not luck, or not entirely. The Capetians were careful. They avoided unnecessary wars. They did not lead their armies into reckless battles. They did not go on crusade as other kings did, risking their lives in distant land. They stayed close to home, tended their small domain, and let time do its work. When a powerful duke died without a male heir, the Capetians were there, ready to assert their rights as suzerain, to claim the land for the crown, or to marry the heiress to a loyal son. When a rival family tore itself apart in civil war, the Capetians watched from Paris, patient, waiting for the moment to step in. The chronicler Orderic Vitalis, writing from his monastery in Normandy, captured the frustration of the Anglo-Norman barons who watched the Capetians rise. "These French kings," he wrote, "are like spiders spinning their webs in corners, waiting for flies to blunder into their grasp. They do not fight like men. They scheme like women." It was meant as an insult, but it was also an accurate description of the Capetian method. Louis VII, who succeeded his father in 1137, embodied both the strengths and the weaknesses of this strategy. He was a deeply religious man, more monk than king, who spent his days in prayer and his nights in penance. He married Eleanor of Aquitaine, the greatest heiress in Europe, a woman of fierce intelligence and boundless energy. For a time, it seemed the Capetian patience had paid its greatest dividend. Through Eleanor, Louis controlled the vast duchy of Aquitaine, a territory larger than the royal domain itself. The dream of Hugh Capet, a united France under a single king, seemed within reach. But Louis was not the man to hold such a prize. He was cold, pious, and distant, while Eleanor was warm, passionate, and worldly. Their marriage soured. When Louis departed on the Second Crusade, dragging Eleanor along against her will, the rift became irreparable. In the courts of Antioch and Jerusalem, Eleanor consorted with her uncle Raymond, a handsome and sophisticated prince. Rumors flew. Louis, consumed by jealousy, forced Eleanor to leave Antioch. The crusade ended in disaster, and when the royal couple returned to France, their marriage was a corpse. In 1152, a council of bishops, conveniently ignoring the fact that the marriage had produced two daughters, declared it invalid on grounds of consanguinity. Eleanor was free, and 8 weeks later, she married Henry Plantagenet, the Count of Anjou and Duke of Normandy, a man 18 years her junior who would soon become King Henry II of England. In a single stroke, the Capetian dream turned into a nightmare. Henry II now controlled not only his own vast inheritance, Normandy, Anjou, Maine, Touraine, but also Eleanor's Aquitaine. His domain stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees, encircling the small royal domain around Paris. The King of England, a vassal of the French crown in theory, was in practice 10 times more powerful than his lord. Louis VII, watching this catastrophe unfold from his palace on the Isle de la Cité, must have felt the weight of his failure. The patient strategy of his ancestors, the careful accumulation of sacred and political capital, seemed to have crumbled in a single, disastrous moment. The Capetian kings had spent nearly 2 centuries building their dynasty. Now, they faced an enemy who could crush them whenever he chose. But Louis VII did not despair. He did what Capetian kings had always done. He waited, he watched, and he began to lay the groundwork for his son's revenge. For Henry II might have been powerful, but he was also surrounded by enemies. His own wife, his own sons, his own barons, all of whom had reasons to hate him. The Capetian strategy of patience, of spider-silk politics, had not failed. It had merely found a new target. And so, when Louis VII died in 1180, he left the throne to his 15-year-old son, Philip. The boy was young, untested, and facing the most powerful ruler Christendom had ever seen. But he carried with him the sacred oil of Reims, the prayers of 100 generations of Capetians, and a burning ambition that would change everything. His name was Philip Augustus, and he would not wait. Philip II, the man history would remember as Philip Augustus, inherited a kingdom teetering on the edge of oblivion. He was 15 years old when his father died, a boy with a sharp mind, a cold stare, and a determination that bordered on obsession. The chroniclers describe him as handsome in his youth, with a ruddy complexion and a confident bearing that belied his years. But they also note something else: a hardness, a lack of warmth, a single-minded focus on the business of kingship that set him apart from his more pious predecessors. His first act as king revealed his priorities. He immediately broke with his mother, Adela of Champagne, and her powerful relatives, who had dominated the court during his father's final years. He sent them away, stripped them of their influence, and surrounded himself with men of humble birth, men who owed everything to him and nothing to the great families of the realm. It was a brutal move, a declaration of independence, and it sent a clear message to every lord in France. This king would not be controlled. But control was a distant dream when the young Philip looked out from his palace in Paris. To the west, the empire of Henry II sprawled across the map like a vast, hungry beast. Henry ruled England, but his heart lay in France. He spoke French, preferred French castles, and spent most of his reign crossing and recrossing his continental domain. He was the richest man in Europe, the most powerful ruler since Charlemagne, and he made no secret of his contempt for the boy who sat on the French throne. Philip, however, had one advantage that Henry, for all his power, could not match. Henry was surrounded by enemies, and the most dangerous of these enemies were his own sons. Richard, Geoffrey, and John, born of his tumultuous marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, grew up hating their father and scheming against him. Eleanor, imprisoned by Henry for supporting their rebellion, fueled their hatred from her cell. The Plantagenet family was a nest of vipers, and Philip, from his small court in Paris, watched them tear each other apart with the patience of a spider. The opportunity came in 1187, when Richard, already renowned as a warrior and known to history as the Lionheart, rebelled against his father once again. He fled to Paris, seeking refuge and alliance. Philip received him with open arms. The two young men, Philip was 22, Richard 30, formed a bond that chroniclers described as almost brotherly. They ate at the same table, slept in the same chamber, and swore oaths of mutual support. To Henry, watching from across the channel, it was a nightmare made flesh. His greatest enemy and his most dangerous son united against him. In the summer of 1189, Philip and Richard launched a coordinated assault on Henry's French land. City after city fell. Castle after castle surrendered. Henry, old and sick, retreated to his fortress at Chinon, the place of his birth. There on July 6, 1189, he died, abandoned by his sons, betrayed by his barons, his vast empire crumbling around him. His last words, according to the chroniclers, were a curse. Shame, shame on a conquered king. Richard, now King of England, Duke of Normandy, Count of Anjou, and Duke of Aquitaine, stood at the pinnacle of power. He was the greatest warrior of his age, a man whose very name inspired terror, and he owed his crown, at least in part, to Philip's support. For a brief moment, it seemed the Capetian and Plantagenet dynasties might coexist in peace, bound by the friendship of their kings. But Philip understood something that Richard, in his arrogance, did not. The Plantagenet Empire was an accident of marriage and inheritance, not a natural political unit. Its various parts, England, Normandy, Anjou, Aquitaine, had little in common. They were held together only by the force of Richard's personality and fear he inspired. And Richard, for all his military genius, was about to make a fatal mistake. In 1190, Richard and Philip departed on the Third Crusade, bound for the Holy Land to liberate Jerusalem from Saladin. They traveled together, fought together, and wintered together in Sicily. But the strain of the crusade, the heat, the disease, the constant pressure of Saladin's armies wore away their friendship. Richard's arrogance, his insistence on being first in everything, grated on Philip. And Philip's cold calculation, his refusal to waste his forces in reckless assaults, struck Richard as cowardice. The breaking point came at Acre, the great port city that the Crusaders besieged for nearly 2 years. When the city finally fell, Richard claimed the lion's share of the credit and the spoil. He insulted Leopold of Austria, tearing down his banner from the city walls. He negotiated with Saladin without consulting Philip, and he made it clear that he, and he alone, would decide the fate of the crusade. Philip had had enough. In July 1191, pleading illness, he abandoned the crusade and sailed for home. Richard, left alone, called him a traitor and a coward. But Philip, safely back in Paris, was already planning his next move. The crusade had given him something more valuable than any victory in the Holy Land. It had given him time, and it had given him Richard's absence. While Richard languished in the east, fighting Saladin to a stalemate and failing to take Jerusalem, Philip began to dismantle his empire. He made contact with Richard's younger brother, John, a treacherous and ambitious man who coveted the throne. He bribed barons in Normandy and Anjou to transfer their allegiance. He married his sister to the heir of Flanders, building an alliance that threatened England from the north. And when Richard, finally returning from the crusade in 1192, was captured and imprisoned by Leopold of Austria, the very man he had insulted at Acre, Philip saw his chance. He wrote to John, urging him to seize the throne. He offered money to Leopold to keep Richard in chains, and he began to plan the invasion of Normandy, the heart of the Plantagenet power in France. For 2 years, while Richard rotted in a German dungeon, Philip struck blow after blow. He took castles. He won defections. He shrank the Plantagenet domain, acre by acre, village by village. When Richard was finally released in 1194, having paid a ransom that emptied England's treasury, he returned to find his empire bleeding. He was furious, and he was determined to take revenge. The war that followed, a 5-year struggle between the two greatest kings of their age, was fought across the fields and forests of northern France. It was a war of sieges, of raids, of sudden marches and desperate defenses. Richard won most of the battles. He was, after all, the greatest warrior of his age. But Philip, the spider, knew that battles were not the same as wars. The end came in 1199, not on a battlefield but in a minor skirmish at the castle of Chalice-Jabral in Aquitaine. Richard, besieging a rebel lord who had reportedly found a hoard of gold, was struck in the shoulder by a crossbow bolt. The wound festered, gangrene set in, and on April 6, 1199, the Lionheart died, killed by a boy with a crossbow, defending a treasure that probably never existed. His brother John inherited the shattered remnants of the Plantagenet Empire, and John, unlike Richard, was no warrior. He was suspicious, cruel, and incompetent, a king who alienated his barons, lost his battles, and earned the contempt of his age. Philip, watching from Paris, must have allowed himself a rare smile. The patient strategy of a century, the careful accumulation of sacred and political capital, the ruthless exploitation of Plantagenet family feuds, it was all about to pay off. In 1202, Philip summoned John to appear before his court to answer charges of misconduct. John, as a vassal of the French crown for his continental lands, was legally obligated to obey. He refused, and Philip, invoking feudal law, declared all John's French lands forfeit to the crown. It was a declaration of war, and over the next decade, Philip waged it with a single-minded ferocity that shocked his contemporaries. He invaded Normandy, conquering it castle by castle. He took Anjou, Maine, Touraine, Poitou. By 1206, John had lost nearly all his ancestral lands in France. The empire that Henry II had built, that Richard had defended, had collapsed. And Philip Augustus, the boy who had inherited a kingdom on the edge of oblivion, now stood as the most powerful ruler in Europe. The Capetian patience had finally found its reward, but Philip was not content to rest. He had conquered lands. Now he needed to bind them to the crown. He built fortresses, established royal officials, and granted charters to towns that promised loyalty. He paved the streets of Paris, walled the city, and made it a capital worthy of a great king. And in 1214, when a coalition of John's allies, the Holy Roman Emperor, the Count of Flanders, the Duke of Brabant, invaded France from the east, Philip rode out to meet them. The Battle of Bouvines, fought on July 27, 1214, was the greatest victory in Capetian history. Philip, fighting on foot in the thick of the struggle, was unhorsed and nearly killed. But his knights rallied, broke the imperial army, and captured the Count of Flanders and a host of other nobles. The emperor fled. John, waiting in the south with his own army, abandoned his invasion and slunk back to England. The victory was total, the triumph absolute. As Philip rode back to Paris, the streets lined with cheering crowds, the cathedral bells ringing across the city, he must have thought of his ancestors, of Hugh Capet, the reluctant king who had held the throne by the grace of men who thought him weak, of Robert the Pious, the gentle saint who had washed the feet of the poor, of Louis VI, the fat warrior who had carried the oriflamme against robber baron, of Louis VII, the failed husband who had lost Aquitaine and watched the Plantagenet Empire rise. They had all played their parts in the long, patient struggle, and now, finally, the struggle was won. But Philip Augustus, the architect of victory, knew that war was not the only path to power. Even as he celebrated, he was planning the next move in the Capetian game. He had conquered land. Now he needed to conquer hearts. And for that, he needed a king so pious, so just, so beloved that the very idea of opposing the Capetians would become unthinkable. That king would be his grandson. His name was Louis, and history would know him as Saint Louis. Chapter 3: The Royal Domain, Conquest by Marriage and Patience. The victory at Bouvines in 1214 marked a turning point not merely in Capetian fortunes, but in the very conception of French kingship. Philip Augustus had done what no Capetian before him had dared to imagine. He had broken the Plantagenet stranglehold and expanded the royal domain from a small cluster of lands around Paris and Orleans to a vast territory encompassing Normandy, Anjou, Maine, Touraine, and Poitou. The King of France was no longer first among equals. He was, for the first time, truly the master of his realm. But Philip understood something that his contemporaries, dazzled by his military triumphs, often missed. Conquest by the sword was only the beginning. Lands taken by force could be lost by force. What mattered was what came next. The slow, patient work of binding those lands to the crown, of weaving them into the fabric of the Capetian domain, of making their people forget that they had ever owed allegiance to any other lord. This was the genius of the Capetian method. They did not merely conquer, they integrated. They did not merely rule, they administered. And in doing so, they transformed the royal domain from a collection of scattered estates into the nucleus of the French state. The tools of this transformation were many. First among them was the network of royal officials known as prévots and bailies. These men, appointed directly by the king and answerable to him alone, represented royal authority in the provinces. They collected taxes, dispensed justice, and ensured that the king's will was obeyed. Unlike the feudal lords, who held their lands by inheritance and owed their loyalty as much to their own families as to the crown, the bailies were creatures of the king. They had no independent power base, no local loyalties, no ambitions beyond pleasing the master who had raised them from obscurity. The establishment of this administrative apparatus was revolutionary. In an age when most kings governed through great lords who often acted as independent potentates, the Capetians built a parallel structure of authority that bypassed the feudal hierarchy entirely. A peasant with a grievance against his lord could now appeal directly to the king's bailey, who had the power to summon the lord to court and render judgment. A town seeking to establish its independence from a local count could negotiate a charter with the crown, receiving royal protection in exchange for loyalty and taxes. Slowly, inexorably, the bonds of feudal allegiance weakened, and the bonds of royal authority strengthened. Philip Augustus also understood the power of physical presence. He was constantly on the move, traveling from castle to castle, city to city, showing his face to his new subjects. He slept in their beds, ate their food, heard their complaints. In an age without mass media, the physical presence of the king was the most potent symbol of royal authority imaginable. When Philip rode through the streets of Rouen, the ancient capital of Normandy, the people who lined the streets did not see a distant, abstract power. They saw a man, flesh and blood, who had come to claim them as his own. But Philip's greatest innovation was architectural. He transformed Paris from a modest town into a capital worthy of a great king. He paved its muddy streets, walled its sprawling suburbs, and began construction on the great fortress of the Louvre, which guarded the city's western approach. He granted charters to its merchants, attracting trade and wealth. He patronized its scholars, drawing students from across Europe to study in the schools that would one day become the University of Paris. By the time of his death in 1223, Paris had become the intellectual and commercial heart of France, a city whose fame rivaled that of Rome itself. When Philip died, he left the throne to his son, Louis VII, a capable warrior who continued his father's work of expansion. Louis conquered Poitou and La Rochelle, pushing the royal domain to the Atlantic coast, but his reign was short. In 1226, returning from a campaign in the south against the heretical Cathars, Louis fell ill with dysentery and died at the age of 39. He left behind a widow, the formidable Blanche of Castile, and a son, Louis IX, who was just 12 years old. Once again, the Capetian dynasty faced the challenge of a child king in a dangerous world. Once again, the great lords of France saw an opportunity to reclaim the power they had lost. And once again, a Capetian woman rose to defend her son's inheritance. Blanche of Castile was a granddaughter of Eleanor of Aquitaine, and she had inherited her grandmother's intelligence, determination, and political skill. She had been raised in the Spanish court, where the long struggle against the Moors had forged a culture of religious fervor and military discipline. She brought that fervor and discipline to France, and she deployed them in the service of her son. The moment Louis VII died, the great lords rebelled. They saw a regency, a woman, a boy king. Surely the Capetian grip would loosen. Surely they could reclaim their ancient independence. But Blanche moved faster. She had Louis IX crowned immediately before the rebels could organize. She rode through the countryside, rallying loyal barons and townsmen. She negotiated, threatened, and bribed, holding the fragile kingdom together by sheer force of will. When the rebels laid siege to the city of Belairm, Blanche personally led an army to relieve it, riding at the head of her troops in full armor, a sight that stunned her contemporaries and broke the rebellion. The chroniclers of the age, men who rarely praised women, wrote of Blanche with awe. She ruled the kingdom with a firm hand, one wrote, and she did so with such wisdom and prudence that the barons who had despised her came to fear her. Another described her as a woman in body, but a man in counsel and courage. She was, in every sense, the guardian of the Capetian legacy, the protector of her son's inheritance. And what an inheritance it was! Louis IX came of age in a kingdom transformed by his grandfather's victories and his mother's determination. The royal domain now stretched from the Somme to the Pyrenees, from the Atlantic to the borders of the empire. The great duchies that had once challenged Capetian authority, Normandy, Anjou, Aquitaine, were now provinces of the crown. The King of France was, for the first time, the richest and most powerful ruler in Europe. But Louis IX was not content to rest on his ancestors' achievements. He had a different vision of kingship, a vision shaped by his mother's piety and his own profound faith. He believed that a king's first duty was not to expand his domain, but to ensure justice for his people. He believed that the crown was not a prize to be enjoyed, but a burden to be borne for the love of God. And he believed that the Capetian Dynasty, blessed by heaven with centuries of rule, had a sacred obligation to rule well. This belief would shape every aspect of his reign. It would make him the most beloved king in French history. It would earn him a reputation for holiness that would lead, within decades of his death, to his canonization as a saint. And it would transform the Capetian dynasty from a successful royal line into something far more powerful, a living symbol of God's favor, a dynasty whose legitimacy could never be questioned because it had been blessed by heaven itself. The question that hung over Louis IX's reign, the question that would define his legacy, was simple. Could a saint be a king? Could a man who sought first the kingdom of heaven also rule effectively on earth? The answer, as Louis would prove, was yes. But the path to that answer would take him through the courts of justice, the halls of power, and finally to the sands of a distant shore, where death awaited him with a crown of thorns. Chapter 4: St. Louis and the Moral Crown. The France over which Louis IX assumed full rule in 1234, at the age of 20, was a kingdom transformed. The military conquests of Philip Augustus and Louis VII had expanded the royal domain to its greatest extent yet. The administrative apparatus of bailies and prévôts had brought royal justice to every corner of the realm. The city of Paris, with its cathedral schools and bustling markets, had become a capital worthy of a great European power. But Louis understood that none of these achievements would endure unless the crown itself commanded something more than fear. It needed love. It needed respect. It needed the willing obedience of a people who believed their king was just. Louis set out to earn that belief from the moment he began to rule independently. His mother, Blanche, had governed with an iron hand during his minority, crushing rebellions and imposing royal authority by force. Louis admired her strength but chose a different path. He would rule not by fear but by example. He would be the most Christian king, the most just king, the most pious king that France had ever known. The chroniclers who knew him best, chief among them the Sieur de Joinville, his friend and biographer, paint a portrait of a man who took the burdens of kingship with deadly seriousness. Louis rose before dawn for prayer, attending multiple masses each day. He wore a hairshirt beneath his royal robes, a garment of rough goat hair that chafed his skin as a constant reminder of Christ's suffering. He fasted regularly, ate simply, and avoided the lavish entertainments that filled the courts of other monarchs. When his advisors suggested that such extreme piety might damage his health, he replied that the health of his soul mattered more than the health of his body. But Louis's piety was not merely personal. It shaped his entire conception of kingship. He believed with absolute conviction that God had placed him on the throne for a purpose, to dispense justice, protect the church, and lead his people to salvation. This was not propaganda or political convenience. It was the organizing principle of his life, the lens through which he viewed every decision, every policy, every act of governance. Nowhere was this more evident than in Louis's administration of justice. In an age when most kings delegated legal matters to professional judges, Louis insisted on hearing cases himself. Every day after Mass, he would make his way to a garden near his palace, or to the woods of Vincennes, where he would sit beneath a great oak tree and invite any of his subjects, rich or poor, noble or peasant, to bring their grievances directly to him. Joinville describes the scene with wonder. Often in summer, he writes, the king would go sit in the forest of Vincennes after Mass and lean against an oak tree and make us sit round him, and all those who had any suit to him could come and speak to him without hindrance from any usher or other official. And the king would ask with his own mouth, "Is there anyone here who has a case?" And those who would stand up, and then he would say, "Keep silent all of you, and you shall be heard, one after the other." Imagine the power of that image. The most powerful king in Europe, robed in silk and gold, sitting on the ground beneath a tree, listening to a peasant woman complain about a stolen cow or a disputed field. For the people of 13th century France, this was not merely justice. It was miracle. It was proof that their king was not like other kings, not like the distant, arbitrary lords who ruled through fear and force. Their king was a father to his people, a shepherd to his flock, a living embodiment of divine mercy on earth. Louis did not merely hear cases, he investigated them personally. He would send his own agents into the provinces to inquire into the conduct of royal officials, punishing those who abused their power and rewarding those who served the people well. He issued ordinances reforming the administration of justice, requiring that all royal officials swear oaths to act fairly and honestly. He forbade the practice of trial by battle, which had long allowed powerful lords to escape justice by defeating their accusers in combat, and replaced it with rational inquiry and testimony. This commitment to justice extended even to those who opposed him. When the lords of the South, the descendants of the Cathar heretics his father had fought, finally submitted to royal authority, Louis did not punish them. He offered them peace, confirmed their rights, and integrated them into the royal administration. He understood that lasting loyalty could not be forced. It had to be earned, and he earned it by treating even his former enemies with the same fairness he showed his humblest subject. But Louis's vision of kingship extended beyond justice to the very fabric of society. He saw himself as the moral guardian of his people, responsible not only for their temporal welfare, but for their eternal salvation. He issued ordinances against blasphemy, gambling, and prostitution. He expelled moneylenders from the kingdom and encouraged the establishment of charitable institutions to care for the poor, the sick, and the orphan. He founded hospitals, monasteries, and convents, dotting the landscape with centers of prayer and healing. His greatest architectural legacy was the Sainte-Chapelle, the royal chapel he built in the heart of Paris to house the most precious relic in Christendom, the crown of thorns. Louis had acquired the crown from the Latin emperor of Constantinople, who was desperate for money and willing to part with even the holiest of objects. The price was enormous, more than the entire cost of building the chapel itself, but Louis paid it without hesitation. For him, the crown of thorns was not merely a relic, it was a direct link to Christ, a physical reminder of the suffering that had redeemed the world. To possess, it was to stand in the shadow of Golgotha, to share in the agony and the glory of the Passion. The Sainte-Chapelle was designed to be a reliquary in stone, a jewel box of light and color that would elevate the soul to heaven. Its walls are mostly glass, stained in deep blues and vibrant reds, depicting scenes from the Bible from Genesis to the Resurrection. When sunlight streams through those windows, the interior glows with an ethereal radiance that seems to dissolve the boundary between earth and heaven. Louis attended Mass there daily, kneeling before the crown, praying for his kingdom and his people. Yet for all his piety, Louis was no passive saint withdrawn from the world. He was a warrior king who led his armies in person, who built fortresses on every frontier, who negotiated with popes and emperors as an equal. When Henry III of England, the son of his great rival King John, attempted to recover the lands his father had lost, Louis marched against him and defeated him in battle. But when peace came, Louis offered generous terms, ceding some territories to Henry in exchange for his homage and friendship. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1259, ended a century of war between England and France and established a peace that would last for nearly 40 years. Louis's magnanimity in victory was not weakness. It was strategy. He understood that lasting peace required mutual respect, that a defeated enemy who retained his dignity was less likely to rebel than one who had been crushed and humiliated. He treated Henry III as a brother, inviting him to Paris, showering him with gifts, and even paying the expenses of his household during his visits. The English king, who had every reason to hate the Capetians, instead became their friend and ally. But Louis's greatest test, the challenge that would define his legacy and ultimately claim his life, came from beyond the borders of France. The Holy Land, the birthplace of Christianity, had fallen once again into Muslim hands. Jerusalem, the city of Christ's Passion, was lost. The Crusader kingdoms established at such cost during the previous century were crumbling, and Louis, the most Christian king, believed that God was calling him to their defense. In 1248, Louis took the cross. He announced his intention to lead a crusade to the east, to liberate the Holy Land from the infidel and restore Christian rule to the places where Christ had walked. His advisors warned him against it. The kingdom was prosperous and peaceful. Why risk everything on a distant adventure? His mother, Blanche, who would serve as regent in his absence, pleaded with him to stay. But Louis would not be dissuaded. He had vowed to serve God, and he would keep his vow whatever the cost. The Seventh Crusade was a disaster. Louis's army landed in Egypt, intending to strike at the heart of Muslim power before moving on to Jerusalem. At first, they succeeded brilliantly, capturing the port city of Damietta without a fight. But then came the march on Cairo, through the treacherous waters of the Nile Delta, in the heat of the Egyptian summer. The Crusaders were slowed by canals, harassed by enemy skirmishers, and weakened by disease. At the Battle of Mansura, they fought desperately but could not break through. And then the Nile rose, cutting off their retreat. Dysentery swept through the army. Louis himself fell ill, so weak that he had to be carried on a litter barely conscious, his soldiers dying around him. The retreat became a rout. Thousands were killed or captured, and Louis, the most powerful king in Europe, the saint in armor, was taken prisoner by the Mamluks. Imagine his humiliation. The King of France, the Lord's anointed, the bearer of the crown of thorns, sat in chains in a Muslim prison, bargaining for his life. His captors demanded an enormous ransom, 1,000,000 gold bezants, half to be paid before his release. Louis, from his cell, negotiated with dignity. He refused to promise never to attack the Muslims again, insisting that as a Christian king, he could not bind his conscience. His captors, impressed by his courage, eventually released him for a smaller ransom and the surrender of Damietta. Louis spent 4 more years in the Holy Land, visiting the shrines of Jerusalem, fortifying the Crusader cities, and negotiating with the Muslim powers. He did not return to France until 1254, 12 years after he had left. The crusade had failed. Thousands of his soldiers were dead. He himself had been a prisoner. By any worldly measure, it was a catastrophe. But the French people did not see it that way. They saw a king who had risked everything for his faith, who had suffered humiliation and captivity rather than renounce Christ, who had returned to them not in triumph but in humility, bearing the scars of his devotion. Louis's failure in Egypt only enhanced his reputation for holiness. He had not conquered, but he had suffered, and in suffering he had imitated Christ. The final act of Louis's life came in 1270, when he took the cross once more. He was old now, in his mid-50s, worn by years of fasting and penance, his body weakened by the diseases he had contracted in Egypt. But his faith burned as brightly as ever. He would lead one more crusade, one last effort to liberate the Holy Land. This time the target was Tunis in North Africa. The strategy, if it can be called that, was confused. Perhaps Louis believed that the ruler of Tunis might convert to Christianity. Perhaps he hoped to use Tunis as a base for a future attack on Egypt. Whatever the plan, it ended in tragedy. The Crusaders landed in the heat of summer and disease swept through their camp. Louis's son, Jean Tristan, born in Damietta during the First Crusade, died of dysentery. Then Louis himself fell ill. On August 25, 1270, as he lay dying on a bed of ashes spread on the ground in the manner of the early Christian hermits, Louis spoke his last words. "Jerusalem," he whispered, "Jerusalem." He was not speaking of the earthly city he had failed to conquer. He was speaking of the heavenly Jerusalem, the city of God, the goal of every Christian pilgrimage. And as he spoke, he died. When news of Louis's death reached France, the grief was universal. Rich and poor, noble and peasant, cleric and layman, all mourned the loss of the king they had loved. Miracles were reported at his tomb. Sick pilgrims who prayed there were healed. The blind received their sight. The lame threw away their crutches. Within 27 years of his death, Pope Boniface VIII canonized him as a saint. Louis IX, the king who had ruled France for 44 years, who had dispensed justice beneath an oak tree and worn a crown of thorns in his heart, became the only king of France to be numbered among the blessed in heaven. The Capetian Dynasty, which had begun with a reluctant king elected by cynical lords, had reached its apotheosis. They had produced a saint, and in doing so, they had placed their dynasty beyond the reach of mere politics. No rival could challenge them now, for to challenge the Capetians was to challenge God's own chosen line. But even as Louis's body was laid to rest in the royal abbey of Saint-Denis, even as the pilgrims flocked to his tomb, The seeds of future tragedy were being sown. Louis's successors, inheriting his moral authority but not his sanctity, would face challenges that piety alone could not solve. And in the centuries to come, a curse would fall upon the Capetian line, a curse born of fire and gold and the destruction of a sacred order. Chapter 5. The Curse of the Temple. The reign of Louis IX marked the zenith of Capetian prestige. His grandson, Philip IV, who ascended the throne in 1285, inherited a kingdom that was not only the most powerful in Europe but also the most revered. The Capetian line, blessed by God and sanctified by a saint, seemed unassailable. But Philip IV was a different kind of king. He was handsome, cold, and calculating, a man contemporaries called the fair not for his justice but for his appearance. Where Louis had ruled through love, Philip would rule through law. Where Louis had sought the kingdom of heaven, Philip sought the treasures of earth. The France Philip inherited was prosperous and expanding. The royal administration, built over centuries by patient Capetian bureaucrats, now reached into every corner of the realm. The king's lawyers, trained in the newly revived Roman law, argued that the king was emperor in his own kingdom, subject to no earthly authority. The king's courts heard cases from all over France, drawing litigation away from feudal and ecclesiastical tribunals. The king's treasury collected taxes, fees, and fines that funded an increasingly elaborate government. But Philip's ambitions outstripped even this growing revenue. He fought expensive wars against England and Flanders, wars that drained the treasury and forced him to seek new sources of income. He debased the currency, minting coins with less silver and pocketing the difference. He taxed the clergy, provoking conflicts with the papacy, and he looked with envious eyes upon the wealthiest, most mysterious, and most vulnerable institution in his kingdom, the Order of the Knights Templar. The Templars had been founded during the First Crusade, nearly 2 centuries before, to protect pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. They had grown into a multinational corporation, a network of fortresses, farms, and banks that spanned Europe and the Middle East. They had developed sophisticated financial instruments, letters of credit, safe deposits, loans, that made them indispensable to kings and merchants alike. They answered only to the Pope, not to any secular ruler, and they were rumored to possess vast treasures, accumulated over generations, hidden in their fortress temple in Paris. By the early 14th century, the Templars had outlived their original purpose. The Holy Land was lost. The Crusader kingdoms had fallen. The Templars, with their military expertise and financial power, seemed less like defenders of the faith and more like a state within a state. They owed loyalty to no king, paid taxes to no treasury, and operated with a secrecy that bred suspicion. Rumors swirled about their initiation ritual, their worship practices, their moral character. They were said to spit on the cross, deny Christ, and engage in unspeakable acts in the darkness of their chapter houses. Most of these rumors were lies spread by enemies and believed by the credulous. But Philip IV did not need to believe them. He needed only to use them. If he could destroy the Templars, he could seize their wealth, eliminate a powerful institution that challenged his authority, and present himself as a defender of the faith against heretics. It was a perfect plan, pious in appearance, profitable in reality. The first step was to secure a compliant pope. The papacy had long resisted Philip's demands to tax the clergy, and the two had clashed repeatedly. But in 1305, Philip succeeded in having his own candidate, Bertrand de Got, elected as Pope Clement V. Clement was weak, indebted to Philip for his elevation, and willing to accommodate the king's wishes. He moved the papal court to Avignon, a city surrounded by French territory, where it would remain for nearly 70 years, effectively under French control. With a pope who would not interfere, Philip moved against the Templar. The arrest was planned in absolute secrecy. On the night of October 12, 1307, royal officials across France opened sealed orders. The next morning at dawn they struck. In every city, town, and village where Templars resided, the king's men burst through the gates of their preceptory, seized their occupants, and confiscated their property. The operation was swift, coordinated, and devastating. Within hours, thousands of Templars, from the Grand Master himself to the humblest serving brother, were in chains. The charges against them were lurid: heresy, blasphemy, sodomy, idolatry. They were accused of worshipping a mysterious head, of denying Christ during their initiation, of performing obscene rituals in secret. The Templars, stunned and disorganized, denied the charges, but Philip's inquisitors, working under royal pressure, had methods of persuasion. The torture began. Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master of the Temple, was an old man in his 60s, a veteran of the Crusades who had spent his life in service to the order. Under torture, he confessed. So did many others. They admitted to spitting on the cross, to denying Christ, to the other absurd charges leveled against them. These confessions, extracted by pain, were carefully recorded and used to justify the arrest. Pope Clement, caught between his duty to the Church and his dependence on Philip, issued a bull ordering the arrest of Templars throughout Europe. The order was doomed. For 7 years, the Templars languished in prisons, subjected to repeated interrogation, their property systematically confiscated and transferred to the crown. Some recanted their confession, insisting they had lied under torture. These were declared relapsed heretics and burned at the stake. Others maintained their innocence to the end and died in their cells. The order itself was formally suppressed by Pope Clement in 1312, its remaining assets transferred to the rival Knights Hospitaller, though Philip, in practice, kept most of the money. The final act came in 1314. Jacques de Molay, who had confessed under torture years before, had spent his imprisonment in relative comfort, allowed to live in a royal palace under guard. But now, with the order dissolved and its property disposed of, he was brought before a commission of cardinals in Paris to hear his final sentence. He was to be imprisoned for life, a living relic of a dead order. What happened next shocked Christendom. As the cardinals read the sentence, de Molay rose to his feet. He declared that he had confessed only because of torture, that the Templars were innocent of the charges against them, that the confessions were lies. The cardinals, stunned, hesitated. They had no authority to judge a relapsed heretic. That was a matter for the secular arm. They handed de Molay and another Templar leader, Geoffrey de Charny, over to the royal officials. Philip acted swiftly. That very evening, March 18, 1314, a pyre was erected on the Isle des Javioques, a small island in the Seine near the royal palace. As the flames rose around them, de Molay and de Charny maintained their innocence. And according to the chroniclers who witnessed the scene, de Molay uttered a curse. He called Philip and Clement before the tribunal of God within a year. He declared that they would follow him to death to answer for their crimes. The chroniclers disagree on the exact words. Some say de Molay summoned them to appear within the year. Others say he gave them 40 days, but all agree on the substance. The Grand Master of the Temple, dying in the flames, pronounced a curse upon the king who had destroyed his order. At the time, it must have seemed like the desperate cry of a dying man. Philip IV was in his prime, healthy and powerful. Pope Clement, though frail, showed no signs of immediate danger. The curse, if anyone thought of it at all, was dismissed as the fantasy of a heretic. But then within the year, both men were dead. Pope Clement V died on April 20, 1314, just over a month after de Molay's execution. He had been suffering from a wasting illness, possibly cancer, and his death, though sudden, was not entirely unexpected. But the timing, so close to the curse, struck many as significant. Philip IV died on November 29, 1314, less than 8 months after de Molay's burning. He had suffered a stroke while hunting, falling from his horse and never fully recovering. His death, like Clement's, came within the year the Grand Master had prophesied. The coincidence was enough to seed a legend. Throughout France, people whispered that the curse of the Templars had fallen upon the king. The dynasty that had ruled for over 3 centuries, that had produced a saint and conquered an empire, now stood under the shadow of divine retribution. But Philip's death was only the beginning. He left behind 3 sons, Louis, Philip, and Charles, each of whom would wear the crown in turn, and each in the years to come would die without a male heir. The curse, if such it was, seemed to be consuming the Capetian line from within. Louis X, called the Quarrelsome, inherited the throne in 1314. He was 25 years old, energetic and ambitious, but his reign was plagued by crisis from the start. The nobles of the provinces, chafing under the centralized administration his father had built, demanded concession. Louis granted them, trading away royal authority for short-term peace. He married Clementia of Hungary, hoping for an heir. But before Clementia could bear a child, Louis fell ill after a strenuous game of tennis. He died on June 5, 1316, leaving behind a pregnant wife and a kingdom in turmoil. Clementia gave birth to a son, John I, who lived for only 5 days. The infant king, the shortest reigning monarch in French history, died on November 20, 1316. The direct Capetian line, which had passed from father to son for over 3 centuries, now faced its first true crisis. Philip the Fair's second son, Philip, claimed the throne, arguing that women could not inherit the crown. He became Philip V, setting aside the claims of his niece, the daughter of Louis X. Philip V, called the Tall, ruled for 6 years. He was capable and energetic, continuing his father's work of centralization and reform. He married his daughters into the great houses of Europe and seemed for a time to have stabilized the dynasty. But he too died without a male heir on January 3, 1322, worn out by dysentery at the age of 30. The crown passed to the third son of Philip the Fair, Charles IV, called the Fair. Charles ruled for 6 years, continuing the policies of his brothers. He married 3 times, desperately seeking a son to carry on the line. His first 2 wives bore daughters. His third, Jeanne d'Evreux, was pregnant when Charles fell ill in early 1328. He died on February 1, 1328, leaving behind another pregnant queen and another uncertain future. Jeanne gave birth to a daughter, Blanche, on April 1, 1328. The child was healthy, but she was female, and according to the principle that had been established by Philip V's accession, a woman could not wear the crown of France. The direct Capetian line, which had ruled for 341 years and produced 12 kings, had run out of sons. The barons and prelates of France gathered to decide the succession. They faced 2 candidates: Edward III of England, the son of Isabella of France, daughter of Philip the Fair, and Philip of Valois, the son of Charles of Valois, brother of Philip the Fair. Edward's claim came through his mother. Philip's came through his father. The assembly, guided by the lawyers who had served the Capetians for generations, reached back into ancient Frankish law to find a principle that would justify their choice. They invoked the Salic law, a dusty legal text from the time of Clovis, which supposedly barred women and their descendants from inheriting land. It was a convenient fiction, a legal technicality deployed to serve a political purpose, but it became the foundation of French succession for centuries to come. On April 1, 1328, the same day that Jeanne d'Evreux gave birth to a daughter, the crown passed to Philip of Valois. He became Philip VI, the first king of the House of Valois, a cadet branch of the Capetian line. The direct line, the descendants of Hugh Capet in unbroken male succession, was extinct. The curse of the temple, if curse it was, had done its work. In just 14 years, Philip the Fair and his 3 sons had died, leaving no male heirs. The dynasty that had built France, that had produced a saint and conquered an empire, had vanished like smoke from a dying fire. But the Capetian legacy did not die with them. The institutions they had built, the royal administration, the system of justice, the sacred aura of the crown survived. The Valois kings, though a new house, ruled in the Capetian manner, governing through the same officials, invoking the same traditions, claiming the same divine favor. And when the Valois in turn failed, the torch passed to the Bourbons, another Capetian cadet branch, who would rule France until the Revolution. The Capetian dynasty, in its widest sense, did not end in 1328. It simply transformed. The blood of Hugh Capet, the reluctant king of Senlis, flowed through the veins of every French king until the monarchy itself was abolished. The soul he had helped forge, the soul of France, the idea of a unified kingdom under a sacred king, outlasted dynasties, revolutions, and empires. The question that remained, the question that haunted the last Capetians as they lay dying without sons, is this: did the curse of the Templars truly fall upon them, or was their extinction merely a coincidence, the random working of biology and fate? The chroniclers who recorded de Mailly's dying words believed in the curse. The people who whispered in the streets of Paris believed in it, and perhaps in their final moments, the sons of Philip the Fair believed in it too. But the true answer lies not in curses or coincidences. It lies in the long arc of history, the patient work of generations, the slow forging of a nation. The Capetians built France, and France, in turn, built them into legend. Chapter 6. The Salic Law and the Silent End. The year 1328 stands as a pivot point in French history, a moment when the certainties of 3 centuries dissolved into question. The direct Capetian line, That unbroken chain of fathers and sons reaching back to Hugh Capet's election in 987 had snapped. The crown, which had passed from anointed hand to anointed hand for 14 generations, now lay on the table, waiting for someone to claim it. The men who gathered to decide its fate knew they were making history. They could not know that their decision would ignite a war that would last for more than a century. The assembly that convened in Paris that spring was not a formal parliament in the modern sense. It was a gathering of the great men of the realm, dukes, counts, bishops, and prelates, summoned to advise the regent, Philip of Valois, on the succession. Philip had been ruling as regent since the death of Charles IV, waiting to see if the late king's widow would bear a son. When Jean d'Evreux gave birth to a daughter, the regency transformed into a claim. Philip of Valois was now a candidate for the throne. But he was not the only candidate. Across the channel in the court of the young Edward III of England, a different claim was being prepared. Edward was the son of Isabella of France, the daughter of Philip the Fair. Through his mother, he was the grandson of a Capetian king. If the crown could pass through the female line, Edward's claim was stronger than Philip's. He was closer in blood to the last direct Capetian. The lawyers who advised the French assembly faced a delicate task. They needed to justify excluding Edward without explicitly admitting that their decision was political rather than legal. They needed a principle, a precedent, a rule that would make their choice seem inevitable rather than arbitrary. And they found it in a dusty legal text that had slept for centuries in the archives of the Abbey of Saint-Denis. The Salic law, or Lex Salica, was a code of law compiled by the Salian Franks in the early 6th century, during the reign of Clovis. It dealt mostly with fines for various offenses, so many solidi for stealing a pig, so many for killing a freeman. Buried in its sections on inheritance was a brief passage. Concerning Salic land, no portion of the inheritance shall come to a woman, but the whole inheritance of the land shall come to the male sex. This provision, intended to prevent estates from passing out of a warrior lineage through marriage, had nothing to do with royal succession in the 14th century, but the lawyers seized upon it and expanded it into a fundamental law of the realm. Their argument, refined over months of debate, ran as follows. The Kingdom of France was not private property but a public trust. It could not be inherited like a farm or a flock of sheep. The king, as the Lord's anointed, held his crown by divine favor and the acclamation of the people. This sacred office, this public trust, could not pass through a woman because a woman, by her very nature, was incapable of exercising. And if the crown could not pass through a woman, then it could not pass to her son either. Edward III, despite his Capetian blood, was barred from the succession by the defect of his mother's sex. This reasoning was innovative, to say the least. No previous Capetian succession had ever invoked the Salic law. When Philip V claimed the throne over his niece in 1316, he had relied on political maneuvering and the assembly's acquiescence, not on ancient legal texts. When Charles IV succeeded Philip V, no one mentioned the Salic law. It was only in 1328, faced with the need to exclude a powerful foreign claimant, that the lawyers elevated this obscure provision into a cornerstone of French constitutional law. The Assembly accepted their reasoning. On April 1, 1328, the same day that Jean d'Evreux gave birth to a daughter, Philip of Valois was proclaimed King of France. He was crowned at Reims on May 29, 1328, receiving the holy oil from the Saint Ampu in a ceremony that deliberately echoed the coronations of his Capetian predecessors. The priests who anointed him, the lords who swore fealty, the crowds who cheered, all of them understood that they were witnessing a transition. The direct line had ended, but the sacred office continued. France still had a king. Philip VI, as he became known, was 44 years old when he ascended the throne. He was experienced, energetic, and eager to prove himself worthy of the crown he had inherited. He had served his Capetian cousins as a military commander and diplomat, and he knew the kingdom intimately. His early reign was promising. He defeated a Flemish uprising at the Battle of Cassel in 1328, demonstrating his military prowess. He negotiated with the papacy, maintained peace with England, and continued the administrative work of his predecessors. But the shadow of 1328 never fully lifted. Edward III, young and ambitious, initially accepted Philip's accession. He traveled to France in 1329 and performed homage for his French land, Gascony and Ponthieu, acknowledging Philip as his lord. But the homage was grudging, the relationship strained. Edward resented being forced to kneel to a man he considered his inferior in blood and status, and as he grew into his power, he began to contemplate asserting his own claim. The spark came from an unexpected direction: Scotland. The kings of Scotland had long been allied with France against England, a relationship known as the Auld Alliance. When Edward III invaded Scotland in 1333, Philip VI saw an opportunity to embarrass his rival. He issued a formal demand that Edward cease his aggression and submit to French arbitration. Edward, furious at this interference, responded with a challenge. In 1337, he formally asserted his claim to the French crown, declaring that Philip was a usurper and that he, Edward, was the true king of France. The 100 Years' War had begun. It is one of the great ironies of history that the Salic law, invented to exclude Edward III from the French succession, became the justification for the longest and most destructive war in medieval European history. For more than a century, English and French armies would march back and forth across the continent, burning villages, slaughtering peasants, and fighting battles that would become legendary. Crécy, Poitiers, Agincourt. These names would echo through the centuries as monuments to English archery and French disaster. The war was not continuous. There were truces, pauses, periods of uneasy peace, but the underlying conflict never fully resolved. The English kings continued to call themselves kings of France, quartering the French lilies with their own leopards. The French kings continued to fight, generation after generation, to expel the English from their soil. And through it all, the Capetian legacy, the centralized administration, the sacred aura of the crown, the loyalty of the Parisian bureaucracy, provided the foundation upon which French resistance was built. The Valois kings, for all their struggles, were Capetians in all but name. They ruled through the same institutions their predecessors had created. They invoked the same traditions of sacred kingship. They sat on the same throne, wore the same crown, received the same holy oil. The transition from Capet to Valois, momentous as it was, changed less than one might expect. The machinery of government continued to function. The royal officials continued to collect taxes and dispense justice. The kingdom, though shaken, did not collapse. But the direct line, the unbroken chain of fathers and sons stretching back to Hugh Capet, was gone, and with it went something intangible yet real, the sense of inevitability that had surrounded the Capetian monarchy. The Valois kings had to prove themselves in ways the Capetians never did. They had to fight for their legitimacy, to earn the loyalty that had once been automatic. The war with England was not merely a territorial dispute. It was a contest for the very soul of the French monarchy. Consider the contrast between the early Capetians and their Valois successors. Hugh Capet, the reluctant king, had held the throne because the great lords wanted a weak king. He did not need to prove his courage or his military skill. He needed only to survive. Philip VI, by contrast, was constantly tested. His nobles expected him to lead them to victory. His people expected him to defend them from invasion. His rivals expected him to fail. And when he did fail, when the English archers slaughtered his knights at Crécy in 1346, when Calais fell to Edward III in 1347, the whispers began. Was this king truly worthy of the crown? Had God withdrawn his favor from the line of Hugh Capet? The question haunted the Valois kings for generations. They answered it with courage, with persistence, with a determination to reclaim the legacy they had inherited. But the shadow of 1328 never fully lifted. The sense that the Capetian line had ended, that something fundamental had been broken, persisted in the collective memory of the French people. And yet the Capetian legacy endured. The institutions they had built, the traditions they had established, the very idea of France they had forged, all of these outlasted the direct line. When Joan of Arc, centuries later, led Charles VII to Reims for his coronation, she was invoking the sacred traditions of Capetian kingship. When the Bourbons, another Capetian cadet branch, ascended the throne in the 16th century, they claimed the same divine right that Hugh Capet had claimed. The blood of the Capets, diluted and dispersed, continued to flow through the veins of French kings until the monarchy itself was abolished in 1792. The Salic law, invented to solve a succession crisis, shaped French history for centuries. It governed the succession of every French king until the Revolution, ensuring that no woman ever sat on the throne of France. It became, in the hands of later lawyers and historians, a fundamental law of the realm, a proof of French exceptionalism, a justification for excluding not only English claimants but any claimant who traced his descent through a female line. The dusty provision from the 6th century, unearthed by the lawyers of 1328, acquired a weight and authority it had never possessed before. But the Salic law could not answer the deeper question that haunted the transition of 1328. What made a king legitimate? Was it blood alone? Was it the approval of the great men of the realm? Was it the sacred oil of Reims? Or was it something more elusive, more mysterious? The accumulated weight of centuries, the loyalty of a people who had come to identify their king with their nation. The Capetians had built their dynasty on all these foundations. They had cultivated the church, married wisely, outlasted their rivals, and produced a saint. They had woven themselves into the fabric of French identity so thoroughly that to be French was, in some sense, to be Capetian. And when the direct line ended, that identity did not end with it. It simply transferred to the new dynasty, the Valois, who inherited not only the crown but the accumulated loyalty of generations. The end of the direct Capetian line was, in many ways, a non-event. There was no civil war, no succession crisis, no dramatic collapse. Philip of Valois ascended the throne peacefully, with the acclamation of the great men of the realm. The machinery of government continued to function. The kingdom continued to exist. The only sign that something had changed was the distant rumble of English thunder, the first stirrings of a storm that would not break for another decade. And yet, for those who understood the history of the Capetian dynasty, the year 1328 marked a profound transition. The line that had begun with a reluctant king in 987, that had survived excommunication, rebellion, and the rise of the Plantagenet Empire, that had produced a saint and conquered a kingdom, that line had ended. The sons of Philip the Fair, 3 kings in 14 years, had died without male heirs. The curse of the Templars, if curse it was, had done its work. But the Capetian legacy did not die with them. It lived on in the institutions they had built, the traditions they had established, the very idea of France they had forged. And when the Valois kings, centuries later, finally drove the English from French soil and united the kingdom under their rule, they did so as heirs to the Capetian legacy. The blood of Hugh Capet, diluted but not extinguished, continued to flow through the veins of French kings until the monarchy itself was swept away by the Revolution. The question that opened our story, how did the weakest king in Europe build the longest ruling dynasty in history, now finds its answer. Hugh Capet built not with swords but with patience. He built not through conquest but through survival. He and his descendants understood that time was their greatest ally, that outlasting their rivals was more important than defeating them. They cultivated the church, married wisely, crowned their sons during their own lifetimes, and let the centuries do their work. And when the direct line finally ended, after 341 years and 12 kings, the dynasty they had built did not collapse. It simply transformed, passing to a cadet branch that would carry the Capetian legacy forward for centuries more. The Capetian dynasty, in its widest sense, did not end in 1328. It continued through the Valois, through the Bourbons, through the Orleans branch, until the French Revolution finally abolished the monarchy in 1792. And even then, the Capetian legacy endured. The centralized state they had built, the national identity they had forged, the very idea of France as a unified kingdom under a sacred king, all of these outlasted the monarchy itself. When the revolutionaries declared the rights of man and the citizen, they were standing on ground the Capetians had prepared. The reluctant king of Senlis, the duke who wore a short cloak and ruled by consent of those who thought him weak, had built more than a dynasty. He had built a nation. Chapter 7. The Echo of 8 Centuries. The story of the Capetian dynasty does not end in 1328, though the direct line does. Like a river that disappears underground only to emerge miles later, the Capetian legacy flows through the remaining centuries of French monarchy, surfacing in unexpected places, shaping events in ways both visible and invisible. To understand the full measure of what Hugh Capet and his descendants built, we must follow that river to its ultimate destination, the end of the French monarchy itself. The Valois kings who succeeded the direct Capetians faced challenges their predecessors could scarcely have imagined. The Hundred Years' War, which began in 1337 and dragged on until 1453, tested the foundations of French kingship as nothing before had done. English armies marched through France at will, sacking towns, burning crops and slaughtering peasants. French knights, confident in their prowess, were cut down by English archers at Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt. French kings were captured, ransomed, and humiliated. For a time, it seemed the kingdom itself might dissolve. Yet the monarchy survived. It survived because the institutions the Capetians had built, the royal administration, the system of justice, the network of loyal towns, provided a framework that could withstand even the shock of military defeat. When King John II was captured at Poitiers in 1356 and taken to London as a prisoner, his son Charles, the Dauphin, governed in his stead. Though only 18 years old, Charles drew upon the accumulated wisdom of Capetian administration. He appointed capable officials, negotiated with rebellious nobles, and slowly rebuilt the kingdom's strength. When he finally ascended the throne as Charles V in 1364, he inherited a realm battered but unbroken. Charles V was called the Wise, and the title was deserved. He understood that the Capetian legacy was not merely a matter of territory or treasure, but of legitimacy, the deep, almost unconscious loyalty of a people who had come to identify their king with their nation. He cultivated that loyalty with care. He patronized scholars and chroniclers who wrote histories celebrating the Capetian line and its Valois successors. He commissioned translations of ancient texts into French, making the learning of the ages accessible to his subjects. He built libraries, fortified Paris, and governed with a deliberateness that echoed the patient strategies of his distant ancestors. But the Capetian legacy manifested most dramatically in the person of Joan of Arc. In 1429, when the English and their Burgundian allies seemed on the verge of final victory, a 17-year-old peasant girl from the village of Domremy appeared at the court of the uncrowned Charles VII. She claimed that saints had spoken to her, commanding her to raise the siege of Orleans and lead the Dauphin to Reims for his coronation. The courtiers mocked her, the theologians questioned, but something in her conviction, her purity, her absolute certainty, moved them to take a chance. Joan of Arc understood, with an intuition that seems almost supernatural, what the Capetians had built. She understood that the sacred oil of Reims, the unbroken tradition of anointed kingship, was more powerful than any army. She understood that a king crowned in the ancient way, with the holy oil that had touched the brows of Clovis and Charlemagne and Hugh Capet, would possess a legitimacy no English claimant could match. And so she fought not merely for territory but for the soul of France, for the idea that France was a kingdom with a sacred king, chosen by God and anointed by heaven. When Charles VII was crowned at Reims on July 17, 1429, with Joan standing nearby holding her banner, the Capetian legacy was reaffirmed. The line that had been broken in 1328 was, in a spiritual sense, restored. The new king, though a Valois, received the same oil, swore the same oaths, and claimed the same divine favor as his Capetian predecessors. The river had emerged from underground, and it flowed as strongly as ever. Joan was burned by the English in 1431, but her work endured. The French monarchy, revitalized by her sacrifice, drove the English from Normandy and Aquitaine, reclaiming the lands the Plantagenets had held for centuries. By 1453, when the last English garrison surrendered, France was united under a single crown for the first time since the days of Charlemagne. The Capetian dream, the vision of a unified kingdom ruled by a sacred king, had finally been realized. The centuries that followed saw the French monarchy reach heights of power and prestige that Hugh Capet could never have imagined. The Valois line continued until 1589, when it too failed, passing the crown to the Bourbons, another Capetian cadet branch. Henry IV, the first Bourbon king, traced his descent through Louis IX, the Saint King, giving him a claim that reached back to the very roots of Capetian legitimacy. When he converted to Catholicism to secure his throne, famously remarking that Paris is well worth a mass, he was acting in the pragmatic tradition of Hugh Capet himself. The Bourbons, like the Valois before them, governed through institutions the Capetians had created. The royal council, the parliaments, the system of provincial governors, All of these had their origins in the administrative innovations of Philip Augustus and Louis IX. The sacred aura of the crown, the belief that the king's touch could cure scrofula, the reverence for the holy oil of Rheims, all of these were Capetian legacies, passed down through centuries like heirlooms too precious to discard. Louis XIV, the Sun King, who ruled from 1643 to 1715, represented the apotheosis of Capetian kingship. He governed without a chief minister, personally controlling every aspect of the state. He built Versailles, that vast palace of glass and gold, as a monument to royal glory. He declared himself the state, absorbing into his person the accumulated authority of 8 centuries of Capetian rule. When he said, "L'état c'est moi," I am the state, he was not merely expressing arrogance. He was articulating a truth that Hugh Capet would have recognized. The king and the kingdom were one. But even as Louis XIV basked in the reflected glory of his ancestors, forces were gathering that would eventually destroy the edifice the Capetians had built. The Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason, rights, and popular sovereignty, challenged the very foundations of sacred kingship. Philosophers like Voltaire and Rousseau asked questions the Capetians had never needed to answer. Why should one man rule by birth? Why should the people obey a king they had not chosen? What gave the Capetians, or their successor, the right to govern France? These questions hung in the air like smoke, invisible but corrosive. The monarchy, for all its power, could not answer them. It could only continue as it had always continued, relying on tradition, habit, and the accumulated weight of centuries. But tradition, habit, and accumulated weight were no match for the forces unleashed in 1789. The French Revolution swept away the monarchy in a storm of violence and idealism. Louis XVI, the great-great-great-great-grandson of Henry IV, was guillotined in 1793, his severed head held up to a cheering crowd. The holy oil of Rheims, the sacred traditions of Capetian kingship, the unbroken line of succession reaching back to Hugh Capet, all of this meant nothing in the face of popular will. The people had chosen a new sovereign, the nation itself. And yet, even in death, the Capetian legacy endured. The revolutionaries who abolished the monarchy did not abolish France. They inherited the centralized state the Capetians had built, the unified territory they had forged, the national identity they had cultivated. When the revolutionaries declared war on Austria in 1792, they mobilized the largest army Europe had ever seen, drawing on the administrative machinery that Philip Augustus had begun to construct 6 centuries before. When Napoleon Bonaparte seized power in 1799, he governed through prefects and officials who were the direct descendants of the Capetian bailies. The forms had changed, but the substance remained. Napoleon, that extraordinary figure who rose from obscurity to dominate Europe, understood the Capetian legacy better than most. When he crowned himself emperor in 1804, he deliberately echoed the coronations of the ancient kings. He summoned the Pope, as the Capetians had done. He wore robes of purple and gold, as the Capetians had done. But in a gesture that spoke volumes, he took the crown from the Pope's hands and placed it on his own head. The sacred king, chosen by God, had become the self-made emperor, chosen by himself. The Capetian tradition was honored, but it was also transformed. The Bourbons were restored after Napoleon's fall, ruling from 1814 to 1830 in a pale imitation of their former glory. They were overthrown again, replaced by the Orleans branch, another Capetian cadet line, which ruled from 1830 to 1848. And then the monarchy ended for good. France became a republic and has remained one ever since. But the Capetian legacy did not end with the monarchy. It lives on in the very idea of France, the centralized state, the unified territory, the national identity that makes French people feel French. When a French citizen today speaks of the hexagon, referring to the shape of their country, they are echoing the boundaries the Capetians spent centuries establishing. When they appeal to the state for justice, they are invoking institutions the Capetians created. When they take pride in French culture, French language, French civilization, they are celebrating achievements the Capetians made possible. The Capetians did not build France alone. They were aided by circumstance, by the church, by the loyalty of generations of officials and soldiers and peasants who believed in the sacred mission of their kings. But they provided the framework, the vision, the patient persistence that transformed a patchwork of feudal lordships into the most powerful, most unified, most culturally influential kingdom in Europe. Hugh Capet, the reluctant king of Senlis, could not have imagined any of this. When he accepted the crown in 987, he was thinking not of future centuries but of the next season, the next harvest, the next threat from a rival lord. He was thinking of survival, but survival pursued with sufficient patience and skill becomes something more. It becomes legacy. It becomes history. It becomes the foundation upon which nations are built. The Capetian Dynasty ruled France for 341 years in direct line, and for nearly 8 centuries in its widest sense. They began with nothing but a crown and a prayer, and they ended with a nation. They were not always wise, not always just, not always successful. They made mistakes, suffered defeats, and died in ways both noble and ignoble, but they endured. They outlasted their rivals, adapted to changing circumstances, and never lost sight of the goal that Hugh Capet had set, to pass the crown to his son. In the end, that is the Capetian legacy. Not conquest, not glory, not even sanctity, but continuity. The patient work of generations, the slow accumulation of authority and legitimacy, the unbroken chain of fathers and sons who understood that their duty was not to themselves but to the future. They built for their children and their children's children and the children of those yet unborn. And in building for the future, they created the past that France still carries with it today. When we walk the streets of Paris, past the Louvre that Philip Augustus began, past the Sainte-Chapelle that Louis IX built, past the palaces and churches and monuments that bear witness to centuries of French history, we are walking in the footsteps of the Capetian. When we speak of French culture, French civilization, French identity, we are speaking a language they helped shape. When we think of France itself, that ancient kingdom, that modern republic, that enduring idea, we are thinking of their greatest creation. The Capetian dynasty ended long ago, but France, the France they built, endures. And so we return to Senlis, to that cold stone hall in the year 987, where a reluctant duke accepted a crown he did not want and could not keep. We see Hugh Capet standing, the weight of the crown just settling onto his brow, the eyes of the great lords watching him with satisfaction. They think they have chosen a puppet. They think they have elected a king who will serve their interests and never challenge their power. They cannot see what we see. They cannot see the 8 centuries that will follow, the generations of Capetian kings who will rule France with patience and persistence. They cannot see Philip Augustus conquering Normandy, Louis IX dispensing justice beneath an oak tree, Philip the Fair destroying the Templars and cursing his line. They cannot see the Valois and the Bourbon, the wars and the triumphs, the revolutions and the restoration. They cannot see the nation that will emerge from their cynical bargain. But Hugh Capet perhaps senses something. As he turns to face the assembly, as he feels the weight of the crown upon his head, he understands that he has become something more than a duke, more than a king. He has become the founder of a line. He has become the beginning of a story that will outlast him, outlast his sons sons for 300 years and more. He has become Hugh Capet, the first of his name, the father of the longest-ruling dynasty in European history. And somewhere in the shadows, in the space between what was and what will be, a question hangs in the air, a question that will echo through the centuries, that will be answered by every Capetian king who ever lived. It is the question that haunts every founder, every builder, every dreamer who dares to imagine a future they will not live to see. Was it worth it? The answer lies in the France we know today, in its cities and its villages, its language and its culture, its enduring identity as a nation. The Capetians built for the future, and the future remembers them.